Good morning. I'm Linda Feldman, Washington Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Our guests today are Democratic strategist Celinda Lake of Lake Research Partners, Republican strategist Ed Goeas of the Terrence Group, and Elleithee, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service. Welcome to all three of you and to our group of reporters. I've known all three of our guests for many years, and I'm delighted that they've joined us today to roll out their latest Battleground Civility poll. Before I turn the floor over to Mo, just a bit of housekeeping. First, please know that this event is being recorded. Also, we would like reporters to remain on camera for the duration of the event, but please put yourself on mute unless I've called on you to ask a question. And now for the ground rules. We are on the record here. Please, no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. And there's no embargo once the event ends. Now I'll turn the floor over to Elleithee of Georgetown University, who will explain the polling partnership that his institute has with Ed and Celinda, and then we'll hear from our two pollsters themselves. The reporters should have all received the poll data and written analysis by the pollsters last night. Okay, Mo, over to you.
Thanks, Linda. It's good to be here. We were joking earlier. I've been to so many of these breakfasts, but always staffing candidates or principals. So it's an honor to actually be here talking with you all instead of just lurking in the corner trying to snag some free food. And it's, Linda, always great to be with you, my former neighbor. Miss hanging out in the neighborhood with you. So, as Linda said, I run the Institute of Politics and Public Service at Georgetown University. I have known Ed and Celinda for years, worked against them sometimes, worked with them. In 2018, Ed joined our institute as a fellow and spent a semester talking with our students about the issue of civility in politics. And I think born out of that, he started thinking, he and Celinda started thinking more and more about the issue. In the beginning of 2019, we were honored when they approached us about moving their storied battleground poll that they've been doing together for 30 years, a poll that I actually learned how to read polls by looking at back when I was in grad school. They decided to move it to our institute, make our institute the new home. And as we were discussing that, we decided to add this new component, tracking voter sentiment and attitudes towards civility in politics, polarization in politics. In short, I was very interested in sort of just understanding how voters over time thought about this. How bad do they think it was? Who do they blame? In some cases, how much do they really truly want it? Or how do they even think about it? How do they define it? And so we've been very proud to have this partnership since the beginning of 2019, where we have been tracking some of these questions through the Battleground Civility poll. We've seen some really interesting dynamics. We were in the field with a poll when January 6th happened. So we were able to see results in the 2 nights leading up to and the 2 nights after and how people thought about it differently. We've done some focus groups on this where we've had a chance to add some real fascinating qualitative context to the quantitative data that the poll shows us. And so this most recent poll, we decided to go in right around the 1-year mark of the Biden presidency. He ran on a promise to unite the country, sort of getting a sense as to how voters think he's doing on that, how the pandemic has impacted it, how a year after January 6th, they view issues around political polarization and, frankly, violence. The poll, and Ed and Celinda will get into it, as for those of you that have covered their battleground polls in the past, you'll know they do the poll, they and their partners do the poll together. And when the data comes back, they would kind of retreat to their separate corners and write their own independent analysis. They did not share these analyses with each other until yesterday. So they're able to take a look at the data, and then you get sort of the benefit of two unvarnished analyses looking at the same data. And all I'll say is it's bad, right? People think it's bad out there. And the bad news is they think it's going to get worse. But the good news is voters still remain really optimistic about the future. They think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but they do believe it's going to get better. And they're pinning it on sort of my constituency, right? On young voters. They believe young voters are in a much different and better place than some of us are. So I'll toss it over to Ed and Celinda. They'll talk through the data, and then we're happy to answer any questions.
Great. And I guess I'll jump in first. A few things about the battleground. This was the 70th battleground we've done since the first one we released in June of 1991. So we've been doing these a long time. That doesn't count the number of surveys we did during several conventions for the battleground and the tracking we did in 3 different presidential years. All combined between all our battleground surveys, we've done over 100,000 interviews, which is a lot of looking at the data over a period of time. This latest edition of the Georgetown University, now Georgetown University Institute of Politics and Public Service, we decided to do just on civility, although there's some carryover where we get into some political type questions. But we thought it would be interesting that it was basically 1 year after he was sworn into office, with a message of unity, one that not only we saw at the time Democrats and independents accepting, but a lot of Republicans accepting it. But what we saw was that message of unity. And I should also mention that in the shadow of January 6th, there was a question leading into his taking office. Would he continue that message of unity, which he did? But that message from a Republican standpoint quickly faded when the first major piece of legislation he did was a bill that he passed very quickly with very little discussion, if any, with Republicans, but 100% of the Democrats voting for it and none of the Republicans voting for it. Since that vote, bringing together the country has been littered with some speed bumps that I like to call them. Some, have been developed by the Republicans, in all fairness, to Celinda and the president. Some provided by, I would almost say manufactured by Fox News. Over the last year, however, not only has there been several surges of COVID keeping the pandemic front and center, but there's also been the collapse of Afghanistan, continued flare-ups at the border, kind of during that same period of time of Afghanistan, and endless reboots of an infrastructure bill that, quite frankly, the overwhelming majority of the country wanted to see, maybe not to a certain level of spending, but they were behind the principle of moving forward on infrastructure, Republican, Democrat, and independent voters alike. But clearly what we saw in the data was around the time period of Afghanistan, we saw basically the honeymoon that Biden had seen at the beginning of his first couple of months in office pretty much came to an end. Since then, there's been a real focus of the voters on economic issues that, quite frankly, neither side has addressed very well in terms of voters' concern on inflation, on cost of living, jobs and the unstable economy. It's not surprising that voters continue to be frustrated with the political environment, given those challenging economic climates that voters find themselves facing. They're very anxious, they're very frustrated about the present, and voter frustrations with the current political environment are also evident throughout this data. Fully 62% of voters feel the country is off on the wrong track, including a majority of voters strongly feeling that the country is off on the wrong track. And this dissatisfaction crosses many demographics, with majorities of men, women, younger voters, middle-aged voters, seniors, all thinking the country is off on the wrong track. In fact, the only two groups that you could look at are base Democratic voters and African-American voters are still net plus. Now, again, in fairness, trying to be somewhat civil in terms of these numbers, I went back and looked all the way back to where we had some tracking on right direction, wrong track. And there's, the times that right track or wrong direction has dropped below 60% are few and far between with the voters. And in fact, I only found two periods of time going back to 1990 that there were times when wrong track dropped below 50%. It's always been net plurality negative, but those two times were right after Obama was elected and right after Biden was elected, for about 2 or 3 months before it turned negative and over 60%. So it's not new to have those negatives out there, but certainly it is an indication that the speed bumps are going to continue in terms of how the voters view it. And I think, unfortunately, leave opening for more and more fighting. On civility and perceptions of civility, voters are certainly pessimistic and frustrated. One of the things, although I was never known as a big fan of Donald Trump during the Trump administration, I always felt Trump was more a sign of symptoms of the disease as opposed to the disease. I always felt our country had to have devolved to a level of incivility to even accept some of the antics that he pulled when he was president that came across as so uncivil. More than 68% of voters feel that the country has become less civil because of COVID and the COVID crisis. More than 6 in 10 Republicans, Independents, and Democrats all share that view about the decreasing level of civility since the beginning of the crisis. You also get a similar feeling that civility has gotten worse again with President Biden as president. Now, they're not blaming him necessarily, but certainly there is a feeling that the environment has gotten, again, more and more uncivil, even though he came in with hopes of unifying the country. The data does have one bright spot for the future, and I'm going to leave it to Celinda to get into some of the specific issues. But we found a majority of voters, 58%, agreeing with the assertion that I'm optimistic about the future because young people are committed to making this country a better place to live. However, even this rosy statement, there's a partisan divide. A majority of Democrats, 82%, agreed with the statement. Independents, 51% with the statement, but only 34% of Republicans believe the statement. Now, I think some of that probably has to do with, at least with those Republican groups, a lot of the youth are perceived to be more Democratic in their leanings. But I like to remind Republicans that there was a period of time, for example, during the Reagan years, where the youth were very, very supportive and very positive about the president. So it's a lot of how do you come across with those young voters. I'm still very optimistic that there's going to be opportunities in the future to move this country to being more civil and believing in a more civil future in terms of how we operate. But I also feel very strongly we have to get out of this kind of trap we've fallen into, where of gotcha politics with the media, quite frankly, and also gotcha politics between Republican and Democrats in their campaigns. And so I'm going to leave it there. And Celinda, turn it over to you and let you fill in some of the blanks.
Thank you. And thank you very much. I want to say three things first. First of all, Linda, so great to be doing this breakfast. And I only regret that it's not in person, but this was always a wonderful opportunity for exchange. Mo, it's been the best move we ever made coming over to your institute. And it's really, you were too modest. It's really your intellectual conceptualism of civility as the addition to this poll. And I think it's one of the longest term contributions of the battleground poll, and took us out of the immediate back and forth to some really long-term thinking at a critical moment about what is going on. I want to thank my team, Daniel, Sandra, and Mac, who are on the call, who were instrumental, and Brian on Ed's team, all very instrumental in doing this work. And then I want to thank one of the best colleagues and best friends I have in the world, Ed Goeas, for his tremendous partnership. So Ed's talked about, there are three big findings that come out of this data, and I'll go through it in a little bit more detail. The first is how deeply pessimistic the country is, and Ed really talked about that. And in some ways, I think in the Trump years, and now it appears in the Biden years, or certainly in the COVID years, there's a new normal of extraordinary pessimism in this country. And this data is certainly not going to be a deviation from that. We do see astounding levels of fear about division. It is one of the top problems that voters are concerned about. And what's really interesting, we're kind of anesthetized to it now, but in the original, and I'll share the data with you in a moment, in the original poll, when we asked this Civil War, non-Civil War question, we were flabbergasted at how high the numbers were, that people thought we were on our way to civil war, and that has persisted during all of the Trump years and into the Biden administration. And of course, January 6th really reinforcing that notion. Is really, it's hard to express how high these numbers are. Actually, the youth are slightly more optimistic, but really across the board, there's one thing that America is united about, and that is how divided we are. And that includes in their personal lives, in their family networks. And they see politicians and a lot of other institutions and the media, frankly, as contributing enormously to the division. And finally, there is one bright spot, particularly if you're a Democrat, in the poll, and that is the faith in youth, which there is some partisanship to it, disappointing partisanship to it. But I think that's right because of the ideology of the youth. But young people and older people and Democrats and people of color incredibly optimistic about what youth can bring to the country in terms of making the country a better place to live for everyone. And it's interesting, in focus group work we did, the youth, we add on to some of our messages, make the future a better place for everyone, no exceptions. And a lot of older voters don't like that word, no exceptions. Like, you can't have everybody, it won't work. The youth respond more strongly to the term no exception. They really have a different frame that they're bringing to the table. So let's talk a little bit about some of these numbers. As Ed said, 62% of the people think the country is going in the wrong direction. Everybody's pessimistic. I think Democrats would be even more pessimistic, except that we're in charge. So right direction, wrong track. Things aren't good, but our guy's better. So they're a little bit divided about that issue. The issue agenda is very diffuse, but it's diffuse because people are worried about lots of things at once. The economy is a top tier issue in the survey. Government spending is a top tier issue and has been increasing. The division in the country, 22% of the public says it's their first or second issue. 26% of independents say it's a major issue. And then there's some issues that differ by party. Climate change being a major, major concern of young people and Democrats. 32% of Democrats rank it as their first or second problem. COVID, a major, major concern of Democrats. 31% rank it as a top issue. Immigration, a top issue for Republicans. 31% rank it as a top issue. Cost of living, very important as an issue. So you have a very broad agenda with America worried about lots and lots of things. People don't think that politics has particularly gotten more civil. In our focus groups, people said, quote, "We're glad the Jerry Springer show is over. We're glad that someone doesn't tweet late at night or tweet, offend Putin in the middle of a conflict." But in general, people are pretty pessimistic about civility and don't think it has particularly gotten better. They also think that COVID has continued to create increased polarization, increased lack of civility. One of the things that's really interesting is the question we asked on January 6th and the insurrection. The investigation of the insurrection has seen a resurgence of concern about civility, about division, about violent protest. And one of the things that's really interesting is that in this data, and it's been true for some time, is that people think that this division can lead to violence. And that's true on the left or the right in people's minds. Democrats obviously extremely concerned about violence and think that the insurrection contributed to it. But 58% of voters overall said the events of January 6th make it more likely that the country will have violent protests in the future. 80% of Democrats, half of independents agree. And the agreement is also greater with women. And a lot of voters believe that insurrection can just not happen again. And watch for this to emerge, I think, thanks to the investigation, to being a more major issue in the elections as it gets tied more to individual political leaders. We have always, the battleground has always had a fundamental principle that issues come and go, but values are more persistent. And so we've had an ongoing interest in values. And the top values in this survey are freedom at 33%, responsibility at 23%, 18% for respect. Stability is also a big concern, particularly among women, and particularly among voters who are concerned about the economy. What's really interesting, and one of the more surprising, and I think one of the more important findings, it is the younger voters and the older voters who are most concerned about respect. 23% of the 18 to 34-year-olds and 23% of the 65-year-olds are most worried about respect. I think that it would be most surprising to both the young and the older voters that they would agree on this issue. The values do have a partisan tone to them. 54% of Republicans value freedom compared to 13% of Democrats. Democrats, interestingly, value responsibility and think of it more in collective than personal terms. COVID has also really increased Democrats' focus on responsibility. 31% of Democrats say responsibility, only 16% of Republicans. And Democrats really favor respect. 25% of Democrats saying that that is their top value. One of the more interesting charts, and I'll hold it up because we're not showing the charts, but I believe all of you have the charts. And this is one of the more, you can pick it out by its colors. This is one of the more important and surprising charts. We have this really interesting question about how much respect do you have among the voters. And one of the things I love about polling is that Conventional wisdom is usually wrong about 95% of the time, plus or minus 5%. And Beltway wisdom is wrong about 100% of the time, plus or minus 5%. So the actor with the most respect is Dr. Fauci. 41% of the voters say that they have a lot of respect for him. Another 13% for 53% total say they have a lot or some respect for him. Now, there is a sea of lack of respect for everybody, but I don't think most people would have thought Dr. Fauci was the most respected figure out there. There is, of course, tremendous partisan polarization. 7% of Republicans saying they have a lot of respect, 72% of Democrats saying they have a lot of respect. The second strongest politician or actor is your state governor. And we're really seeing, as people get more and more disgusted with both parties at the national scene, that they're moving their focus down to their state governors. So 58% say they have respect for their governor. One of the things that reinforces this is red states tend to have Republican governors, blue states tend to have Democratic governors, so they more often agree with their governor. The third highest respect is Black Lives Matter. 54% of Americans say they have a lot or some respect for Black Lives Matter. And then President Joe Biden, 54% of the voters say they have a lot of respect. There's obviously tremendous polarization, but with all this talk about different kinds of division and divisions within the Democrats, 87% of Democrats say they have a respect for Black Lives Matter, a lot or some. Only 20% of Republicans. And again, when we come to Biden, partisanly polarized, but Democrats united, 93% of Democrats said they have a lot or some respect for Biden. So again, what I love is conventional wisdom often wrong. What is interesting in this data is that both parties are held in equal disrespect. And there is a lot of disregard for both parties, particularly in Washington. I think both parties need to watch that in terms of mobilizing their base and appealing to those independents. And then in fairness, of course, we had to ask the news media, and this won't come as a surprise to you. People love the reporters who come to the Christian Science Monitor breakfast. Yeah. But in terms of media outlets, there is a lot of partisan polarization and a limited amount of respect. I guess the cup is half full or half empty. One of the things that's interesting is that, sorry about that, Fox is less respected by Republicans than Democrats respect CNN and MSNBC. There has been some real division there around Fox, and you see it in the data. The final point, and there's lots more data in there, and we'll be glad to get you breaks if you're curious about the media. Last thing I want to say, and I think both of us really shocked by this data and reassured by this data. Division in the country, again, we have seen this before, but we're on a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 means the edge of civil war, 72, 73, the average rating is 73. That is just, we would be shocked at those numbers, and they have been pretty persistent. And there is a bipartisan consensus on this. 71% is the rating for Republicans, 68 the rating for independents, 70 the rating for Democrats. There is a bipartisan consensus that we are seriously divided and precariously close to civil war even now. Younger voters slightly more hopeful, interestingly. And of course, our hope resides in them. 58% of Americans say, I'm optimistic about the future because young people are committed to making this country a better place to live for everyone. And 74% of young people agree with that statement. But the oldest voters, 61%, agree with that statement. And again, you see this really interesting coalition that frankly no one has written about, of the youngest and the oldest voters, when we all thinking of the generations at loggerheads. In fact, the generations are sharing some very, very common values and common perspective about the future. 82% of Democrats have their faith in the young people, 51% of independents, 34% of Republicans. And people of color, very optimistic about young people. 79% of African American voters, 67% of Latino voters, optimistic about the youth being able to make this country a better place for everyone. So that seems like an appropriate point to end on. And I turn it back.
All right. Well, thank you, Celinda and Ed and Mo. I'll begin with a few questions and then we'll go to other reporters present. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the raised hand feature found under reactions at the bottom of your screen. And please remain on mute until you've been called on. So yeah, lots to chew on in this poll, lots of interesting data points. So this whole issue of civility is interesting to me because people say they want civility. I mean, that's kind of the right answer, right? So sometimes I worry that in polls that people will sort of give what they think is the right answer, even though if they might have a different view. And I'm thinking in particular about the fact that Donald Trump was elected president once by being very uncivil. And, I was in Florida recently went to a local Republican meeting in Weston, Florida, which happens to be the hometown of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the Democratic Congresswoman. And they all love Donald Trump, but some of them don't want him to run again because they think he's too divisive and too polarizing. But at the same time, they love him. And if he is the nominee, they'll vote for him again for sure. So this whole issue of civility, I wonder if the polling is maybe a little misleading, that in fact, there's benefit to politicians by being uncivil. I mean, we had Joe Biden the other day caught on a mic using profanity and discussing Pete Ducey of Fox News. And he, of course, called Peter and apologized. But I heard some millennials actually saying they liked that moment for Joe Biden because he was being, quote, authentic. So I guess this is a question for our experts. Is incivility in some ways a plus for politicians who want to get attention, want to get on the news, want to be seen as tough and a fighter, which for Donald Trump was certainly a plus?
Why don't I jump in, Celinda? Boy, there's so much there in terms of what you just asked. First of all, mentioning the millennials, it's interesting that on belief that the youth are the future in terms of making this country better, there was one age cohort that disagreed with that. They were upside down, negative. And that, interestingly enough, was 34 to 44-year-olds, the millennials. Well, I guess not quite the millennials, but it's the group right ahead of that youth that was most negative about the youth playing a role in that. Celinda and I came out of the fellowship at Georgetown and the interaction with the students during that. And I think there's a little bit of uniqueness to Georgetown in that the teachings of Georgetown is very much listen to both sides. But I came out of that believing that when Trump was gone, I think I wanted to write a book on civility. And when I saw Trump was gone, I kind of added a thought of including Celinda in writing that book because our relationship over the last 30 years, and it's ended up being an amazing relationship in terms of respect, came from us writing separate strategic analysis and coming to respect each other's insight and honesty, quite frankly, in terms of the numbers. And in writing the book, and hopefully will be released before the end of this year, we started off writing about civility and quickly came to understand that civility was just the language of respect. And so we've changed the title to A Question of Respect in terms of the book. I think one of the things that has always bothered me, and I think I have a reputation in the campaigns that I do for promoting running positive campaigns about why our candidate is a good candidate to be elected, as opposed to why the other one should not be elected. And I think, unfortunately, too many of our campaigns have gotten in that direction, that it focuses on the negative, not the positive in the campaigns. I hate those, quite frankly, who always say, well, negative works. Because my feeling is, and my experience has been running positive campaigns, is that positive works also. You got to try it. And unfortunately, too few of our campaigns are trying it in terms of running positive campaigns. I think we need to go through a period of time where we are, as a country, kind of in a death spiral of incivility, where incivility is accepted. They don't like it, perhaps, but it's accepted. And that's what we kind of have to turn around. So I think a lot of what you say is perhaps true, but I tell you, one of the most disturbing things for me, because I consider myself very close to the evangelicals of this country, is how accepting evangelicals became of Donald Trump and his character. And I think what we saw was kind of a middle ground for a lot of those more conservative voters who say, I like his policies, but I don't like his persona. I think now that he is gone, they're focusing a little bit more back on, I don't like his persona. And if we can get conservative without the nastiness, I think Trump could be in real trouble.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess the counterexample might be Ronald Reagan, who, of course, very conservative, but I don't remember any moments of incivility for him. So I don't know, sometimes it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but if we've got used to incivility, can we become unused to that? And I don't know. And Celinda, if you want to.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of points. I mean, I think one thing you're saying, Linda, and the book really goes into this, there are a lot of short-term incentive structures in our culture, in our politics right now, that promote instability. How you raise small donor online contributions, how you get social media clicks, which I would say, you all as reporters know that firsthand too, and the reward structure for clicks rather than thoughtful ideas. The fact that the negative gets covered more, whether it's local channel 6 or the New York Times or Washington Post. So there you get volunteers. So there are a lot of things that are incentivizing. But I would actually argue with you that Donald Trump won his first campaign despite his incivility. It helped create a base, but he had, he was really working hard to hold on to certain voters by arguing that he was better on the economy, better as a strong leader, but that doesn't necessarily mean a nasty leader. And then that he lost in 4 years later because of his incivility. And his numbers are down now. His numbers are people constantly talk about Biden's numbers being down. Look at Trump's numbers are down. And you would have thought everybody kind of had formed their opinion on Trump. So I think there are a lot of short-term incentive structures. But, I was flabbergasted. Here we have an economy the way we have it. We have the Republicans and Trump 10 points ahead of the Democrats and Biden on the economy. And Donald Trump is talking about pardoning insurrectionists and violent criminals. I mean, that's just crazy. Why aren't you, if you want to beat us, why aren't you running on the economy? And so I think there's a tremendous cost. But the problem is there's a lot of short-term incentive structures that take all the candidates and a lot of our institutions into more disrespectful behavior. Doesn't mean that it's winning and doesn't mean that the voters like it.
Right. And
Linda, can I build on that just real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, because this has been one of the things I've been the most interested in as we've tracked this conversation over time. It's where are the voters on this? Because I do believe that politics is market driven, right? The political marketplace gives us the politics that we have. Right. And Celinda's absolutely right about the short-term incentives. The way we frame the question matters, right? Yeah, if you ask people, do you want more civility in politics? Like 97% say yes, right? Something like that. But we've asked it a few different ways. Ed and Celinda have asked it a few different ways that have been fascinating to me. And a couple of examples. Agree or disagree with the following statement. This isn't in the most recent iteration of the poll, but it's been in several previous iterations. Agree or disagree with this statement. Common ground and compromise are noble goals I want my leaders to aspire to. About 78% of people say they agree with that. Mm-hmm. Very next question. I am tired of leaders who compromise on my values. I want them to stand up and fight the other side. 73% say they agree with that, right? I want us to find common ground, just come to where I'm standing and then we'll be on common ground, right? Mm-hmm. You see the values question that Celinda was talking about, where we ask them to rate what values matter to them. Fascinating, because just that list of values, you see how it's playing out in the national debate over COVID response. The top two values, and there's a huge partisan divide, are freedom and responsibility, right? With Republicans gravitating towards freedom, Democrats gravitating towards responsibility as the values. And we're seeing when those two values come into conflict in real time with pretty significant consequences, how that's playing out. Mm-hmm. How much do people really want it? I think, again, it depends on how you ask it. And I think this Civil War sort of heat thermometer that we've been asking, right, is a great way for political leaders to think about this. Voters may be conflicted on what civility means to them, mm-hmm. but when they believe we are 3/4 of the way towards civil war, and universally believe that, mm-hmm. right, that gives us something, I think, to kind of focus on, because otherwise it gets complicated. We can't even agree what we're not even unified on what it means to be unified, right? We can't even agree on what that word means, but we know that we're in really precarious situations, in a very precarious situation that could be leading to violence, and we know we don't like that. Yeah. And if we can kind of use that as the starting point for this conversation, then I think we can figure out how to tackle it.
Right. That leads into, if I can, a couple of things. One is what was totally missed by the media, quite frankly, in the 2020 presidential campaign is, yes, they kept talking about suburban women. Suburban women left not only Trump, but to some extent left in large part the Republican Party in the 2018 campaign. That happened right after Trump took over, that they moved step by step, further and further away. The group that softened during the 2020 campaign of Republicans were older Republicans, not suburban women. They had already left. And that was the Achilles heel of Trump, that as he would continue with his being uncivil, it showed up. Now, on what Mo just said, we do have another thing we were going to announce today. Celinda's firm and our firm has been working with Dynama. They are getting into modeling. They have data lists, and they have taken the entire voter list and developed a model off of our Civil War question of various surveys, and they have applied a score to all the voters in the country. And they are about ready to make that list available. And we're going to be working with Georgetown on this also, to all candidates, Democrat and Republican. So if they are truly interested in being more civil, we have a roadmap that we can provide to them of voters that are really interested in it. And that's going to be made available very, very soon.
So when you polled on the question of the Civil War, did you describe what you mean by the term Civil War? You just let people kind of interpret it how they will and then answer the question?
Yes and no on both. let me get you the exact wording, but no, we let people fill in for themselves, but we use the word violence, which is, so we said 0, there is no political division in the country. 100 is a political division on the edge of a civil war. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest with you, when we first developed this question, and credit to Mo and Ed, I said, oh my God, people, we cannot say edge of civil war. We're just going to push people down. That's too strong. Far from too strong in people's minds. So I think there are also, Linda, in the origin of your original question, there are two kinds of divisions, at least from the Democratic perspective. Mm-hmm. One is division of rhetoric, and the other is far, in my opinion, the incivility, if you will, the lack of respect embedded in certain policy choices. Mm-hmm. And for Democrats, the collective responsibility and respect, that they rank both of those values higher. There is a lack of respect and a lack of civility when, from a Democratic perspective, when you don't provide health care for everyone, when you use racism, when you weaponize and use racism as a political tool. So I think it's pretty serious here. We're not just talking about whether someone off the mic curses at a reporter that voters don't like either, or whether, or even in Donald Trump's case, whether he's less political because he wasn't a politician anyway, as voters would say. We're talking about serious kinds of lack of respect and incivility, and we're talking about moving away from the day when, I often give the example, we worked for the coalition on foster care, and that bill was co-sponsored by Tom DeLay and Hillary Clinton, the biggest reform in foster care in this country. We're a long way from being able to achieve those things anymore.
Okay. So Celinda, I wanted to ask you, I noticed something interesting in the poll, and that is the big difference in public respect for Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. So you have Joe Biden at 54%, while Donald Trump is at 41%. And that's interesting to me because if you look at their Joe Biden's job approval, so the 538 average for Joe Biden is 42%. And Donald Trump in his favorability is at 41%. So they're at rough. I mean, I know they're not completely parallel because Trump is no longer president, but still they're, in terms of their approval, they're at roughly the same place. But Joe Biden has way more so-called respect. And I guess it's because Donald Trump doesn't have as much respect among Republicans as Biden has among Democrats. So I'm interested in what three of you think about this.
Yeah, and also independents and women. So independents have a lot more respect for Joe Biden than for Donald Trump. Okay. The other inverse of that number, by the way, that I think I'm really glad you looked at that up. 34% of the voters say, I have no respect for Joe Biden. 46%, almost half of the voters say, I have no respect for Donald Trump. So it's true on both sides, the respect and the lack of respect. And that's why I would say that I think that Donald Trump is, I'm not an expert on Donald Trump. I'm not an expert on Republicans, and I defer to Ed. But from the Democratic perspective, he's doubling down on the most divisive aspects of his agenda, and it's failing with the broader public. It is not a re-election. It's not a good re-election strategy.
It's also it is affecting those Republicans that said they liked his policies but didn't like his persona. They're tired of it, and they're just worn out from it. They're worn out from defending it by taking a position of I like his policies, and they're worn out because they don't like the way it makes them look.
Okay. Did you want to weigh in on this, Mo, or are you good?
I mean, all I was going to say, and this is my old operative hat on, I think, the more the midterms, right? Not even looking ahead to 24, the more the midterms are about Donald Trump, I think the better it is for Democrats. And, what you saw in Virginia, as much as my friend Terry McAuliffe tried to make it about Donald Trump, Glenn Youngkin wouldn't allow it. And Donald Trump behaved. He stayed out of the state.
Right.
And so it wasn't really about him. I'm going to be much more curious in places like Georgia, where they're going, where he's going all in, and the Republican candidates, right? Arizona, where the Republican candidates are trying to prove themselves to be the Trumpiest. Mm-hmm. That's a different dynamic. Right. And I think it comes back to this exact question, this exact dynamic that you pinpointed. Mm-hmm. If it's about him, it's a different race than if it's not.
Right.
And I have a much different view of that, having been involved in the Youngkin campaign. He wasn't Donald Trump. He didn't try to be Donald Trump personality-wise. And it is interesting that they ran per market over 7,500 anti-Trump spots through 9 different type of spots, going after Youngkin and trying to tie him to Trump, and it never happened. They spent an overwhelming amount of their campaign trying to make it about Trump, and it didn't work. I think Mo is right, but the bigger thing the Democrats are facing, and we saw this, is that the intensity of the out party, which is traditional in non-presidential years, is higher amongst Republicans than it is because of Democrats. And it's not because of Trump. Mm. And what the Democrats tried to do in Virginia was raise their intensity by going after Trump, and it didn't work because they weren't saying enough. We always tried to equated the McAuliffe campaign to a senator from years before, governor from years before who's running for Senate, and not understanding there was a disconnect there. I think the mistake they made was that they thought they were working from a position of strength on what he had done for governor, but he hadn't been governor for several years. And memory is very short.
Yeah, and the point I'm making is that that strategy would work if Republicans allowed it to work. If Republicans embraced him, if Trump had come into the state regularly, as he's doing in Georgia, as he did in Arizona. The more Trump shows up and makes the race about him, and the more the Republican candidates wrap their arms around him, neither was the case in Virginia, right? Then it's different.
Okay, so we're actually running out of time here, but Haley Fuller of the Boston Globe would like to ask a question. So Haley, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a very basic question, but I was curious what the sample size ended up being for the number of people you polled. I didn't see it in the data that was sent out. So.
Yeah.
So
it's 1,000 voters, likely voters, and the error on it is plus or minus 3%. We should have included that. And we reached it on both text and phone.
Okay, great.
Good
Thank
question.
you so much.
And then I was curious, when you describe somebody as an independent, how do you define that? Did you include leaners in the Democrats and the Republicans, or are the leaners all in the independent pile, people who aren't registered or identify as independent?
You know what I think, and Brian, I'm going to look at you. I think I said that wrong. I apologize, Linda. I think it was 800 people. And then I'll let Brian answer the question on independence. Sorry about that.
Oh, sure. So it's 2 things. One, Celinda's right. It was 800 likely voters. We just screened them on asking them if they were likely to vote. If they said not at all, we screened them out. So that's 3.5 margin of error. And then for independents, we have 2 ways to cut it. The one where I think you're looking at most often is we ask, party ID question, which party do most identify with?
Okay.
If
an independent, but they typically vote Democrat or Republican, then you counted them as a D or an R.
Yeah, we put leaners in with the others. So if you have lean Republican, lean Democrat, we put you in with them. But I think Ed has a supplemental point about some a centrist stuff.
Yeah, and I do want to mention the centrist stuff because it's something that we have been doing the last couple of surveys, battleground surveys, and it's quite interesting. First of all, for 30 years, and I think we finally have convinced Celinda to kind of look at it this way. We on ideology, we ask, are you conservative or liberal? We do not ask, are you moderate? Mm-hmm. We feel that's a safe haven that voters naturally go to. And in 30 years of asking that question, we've never had moderate break 10% of our sample. But then we come back and we ask, are you very conservative or somewhat conservative, very liberal or somewhat liberal? And recently we began taking the very conservative and very liberal and putting them on the two ends and combining the somewhat conservative, somewhat liberal, and moderates. The reason why we don't ask moderate is that and I have problems with that term moderate, is that it's been demonized by the far right and the far left for years, that if you're a moderate, you just have no opinion, you're squishy, you don't think about these things. Mm-hmm. The reality is when you combine the somewhat conservative, somewhat liberal, and the volunteer identify as moderate, it comprises 2/3 of the electorate. It runs in somewhere between 65 and 70%. Okay. I think very often our politics in the national dialogue are driven by the two, far right and far left, right, when in fact that's not where a majority of the country is. Sure. They are not driven purely by ideology when they look at problems and solutions. And it's been very interesting looking at that data.
Okay, so let me just throw in one more thing. We haven't mentioned in the last hour, we haven't mentioned social media or just media. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the recent examples of people damaging themselves by using Twitter. So Bette Midler going after the governor of West Virginia, and then he the other day, holding up his dog in a kind of obscene way. And Whoopi Goldberg on The View saying something dumb and, being suspended for 2 weeks. I mean, so there's tradition, there's TV, there's cable, and then there's social media. Those things are all here to stay. So how do we get over this incivility plague in the midst of all these opportunities to react too quickly and thoughtlessly and in ways that if you just stop for a moment and think, maybe you wouldn't go there?
Maybe I'll respond a little bit differently. Part of my coming out of the fellowship at Georgetown, being encouraged, Georgetown gives you a student strategy team of 5 students that work with you in terms of setting up the discussions, what needs to be discussed, what the students are interested in. In my very last session that I did with the students, I had 2 of my 5, the 2 more democratic members of my student strategy team, said, in the last week from our discussions, I've come to understand that I almost went and liked something that was there and realized I was liking something that in fact was uncivil, mm-hmm, and that they decided not to like it. And I thought that was very insightful, that can we get people to a point that they understand it's not just what they're saying, mm-hmm, people are saying out there, it's the likes that are following it up that are encouraging more incivility. So somewhere I think we need to deal with it. I don't know exactly what the path is, but certainly social media has played a major, major, major part in the increase in incivility in this country.
Sure. And is this a sort of a case of we as a society need to learn how to be more responsible and more thoughtful on social media? Because it's not going to go away.
Well, and I think some of it is bringing people out of hiding. That so much of the early incivility was promoted by you could get on and be a jerk, mm-hmm, and not necessarily have to face the consequences. I think the more people face the consequences of that, including liking things that are not liked, right, that are not likable, I think we can start moving in that direction.
I mean, I think part of the problem, Linda, we're increasingly creating these echo chambers for ourselves, right? And that's isolating us from other perspectives. And when we isolate ourselves from other perspectives, we demonize those other perspectives. People, both your sort of traditional media and social media add to that. Right. But there's one big difference, right? Social media, I am choosing, right? I'm going to choose a media outlet that reinforces what I already think. And that's not great, right? Like I'd be better served if I had a more balanced media diet. With social media, it's different, right? I may not be choosing. The algorithms may be choosing for me who is in my feed. And so I've got a certain amount of responsibility, certainly, right? Like I out there seeking out my feed has an equal number of conservative voices in it as progressive voices, but I had to work to do that. Mm-hmm. Right. What happens is, the algorithms keep spitting out, if you liked this person or if you liked this article, here's a few more that sound exactly like it. Mm-hmm. And we're just creating these alternate universes. And that's where it gets insidious, right? At least with traditional media, I've got more choice than I initially have with social media. But we all have to work a little bit harder at finding that balanced information diet.
Sure. All right, good. Well, it's now 10:02. We've reached the end of our hour. Celinda had to leave a few moments ago. I want to thank her in absentia, and Ed and Mo, thank you all for coming. It was great. And hopefully we can do this in person for real and actually see each other. There's nothing like in-person interaction, especially when we're, talking about civility. So anyway, thank you, and hope to see you soon. Bye,
Thanks
everybody.
so much. Yeah.
Okay, take care.